The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation of September 22nd, 1862 has a line in it authorizing compensation for colonization. This was Lincoln's pet project. He still believed in it. The final Emancipation Proclamation that I hope you will all read, no mention whatsoever of colonization. He abandons colonization. What does he put in its place? The enlistment of black soldiers. It is the Emancipation Proclamation that authorizes the enlistment of black soldiers. And by war's end, that is going to play an absolutely critical role. Some 179,000 black men are going to fight for the Union. They're not only going to help win the war, but they're also going to, by fighting for their country, and this has always been true in America, right? You fight for your country, you're entitled to certain citizenship rights. Make the case of being entitled to citizenship rights and rights to vote. Now, this is a complicated cartoon because it perpetuates a lot of the racial stereotypes of the day. The Sambo character, diminutive African-American soldier. There are lots of debates about what kind of soldiers would they make. But also, in sort of classic Lincoln fashion, he's self-deprecating here. He says, "You are no more handsome than I am myself." Paying attention to the fact that time and again people talk about his looks. But as to sending him back to slavery, I would never do it. And he has his hand on his shoulder. So this is another of the ways in which the final proclamation is a more radical document. It evolves over time. Rather than giving in to the argument to retract it, Lincoln becomes even more determined, even more steadfast. He despaired over the notion of the supplicating, kneeling slave before him. He didn't like that image. And so here's a print that suggests Lincoln is pointing to God. Don't thank me, but thank God for your freedom. And this Thomas Nast portrait of emancipation, Thomas Nast, the famous political cartoonist, is responsible for the icons of the donkey and the elephant for the political parties. He invents this panorama style of telling the story. And on the left-hand side, we have the before picture, the horrors of slavery, the evils of slavery. On the right-hand side, a vision of what emancipation can mean: schooling, religion, commerce, and an idealized vision of a middle-class family inside celebrating their freedom. Notice the pendant in the middle, Father Time. When it's reissued, January 1st came, and Lincoln prepared to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. He was going to sign it in the morning, and it's delivered to his desk, and he notices that the superscription is wrong. And Lincoln says, this document, of all documents, will not go out with an error. The lawyer in Lincoln is very, very careful. So he sends it back, and he spends the next 3 hours at his New Year's Day greetings of politicians and ambassadors and others. And he's shaking hands for 3 hours. And at the end of 3 hours, he goes back to his office to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And he notices that his hand is shaking. And he says, this, of all documents, cannot be signed with a tremulous hand. I don't want anyone to think that at the last minute, my nerves got the best of me. And so he uses that self-control that he had, he quiets his hand, and he signs the document. After signing it, the Assistant Secretary of State, William Seward's son, later wrote that Lincoln declared the following: I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. At the time, people understood what in some ways has been lost to us. And I think the occasion of the sesquicentennial on January 1st, 2013 is a good moment to recall that at the time, people believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was the single most important document in American history, second only to the Declaration of Independence, and perhaps even surpassed it. Frederick Douglass. The 4th of July was great, but the 1st of January, when we consider it in all its relations and bearings, even greater. On July 4th, 1865, after the war was over, the men of the 22nd Iowa Infantry, stationed in Savannah, Georgia, held a regimental parade, at the end of which 2 documents were read aloud: the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation. Thank you. I wanted to leave some time, and I believe we do have some time for questions, because invariably this is a topic that generates lots of questions, perhaps even more so these days, because apparently there's a very popular film out there about Lincoln. Just one thing that I'll say before we take questions, of course, is this is the prequel, if you will, to the story told in Spielberg's Lincoln. Right? That story of passing the 13th Amendment is a true story, and Lincoln was, as we know, insistent about it. But you can't really understand that story in some ways unless you see the longer arc, the way in which he begins to make a commitment to emancipation, and after having made the commitment to emancipation, recognizing that we need to go further, because what if the Emancipation Proclamation is one day found unconstitutional? Or what if the election of someone antipathetic to freedom overturns it, which helps to explain then, of course, the need for the 13th Amendment. The easy difference is the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But questions? There's a microphone.
I have a comment rather than a question. I must compliment you on your presentation. And number 2, your distinction between the first and the second Emancipation Proclamation, the difference was very clear and very helpful in understanding what those 2 were. You simplified, to me, what was a complicated subject.
Well, thank you very much for that. Let me also take this opportunity to add one point that I neglected to mention in my talk. Remember, I said it changes in several ways. I said a colonization is abandoned. I said the enlistment, the authorization of black troops. There's one more thing that needs to be mentioned. You know, a lot of people have been cool to the Emancipation Proclamation because of the way it's written. They expect soaring, beautiful prose, no less from Abraham Lincoln, who we know is capable of soaring, beautiful prose, because there are reasons why it's written the way in which it's written, right? It's an order, it's an executive order under his authority as commander-in-chief. It's very clearly and specifically construed, almost like a legal document. But he adds a line at the end. And you may think that I'm making too much of this line, but I love this line. And the line is this: upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice. It's a subordinate clause, but it carries a lot with me, right? And it comes first. Warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of an almighty God. That line is added. It does not appear in the September 22nd line. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Are these prints in the book? Any of these?
Yeah, these prints are in the book. Many of them, you know, the wonders of the Library of Congress. There's a fantastic collection of prints and photographs. So you can also go online and see them. But I've included these as well as many other pictures and prints, because you know, the 19th century is not only a written culture, it's also a visual culture. So it's important also to understand, just as we do today, you know, a cartoon carries a lot of weight for a lot of people who aren't reading editorials in the paper. And so recapturing those contemporary cartoons is very, very important. Question back here.
150 years ago next week, Lincoln went through something that's been called the cabinet crisis. Again, during the 100 days. Could you tell us something about that cabinet crisis and how Lincoln took care of it?
Well, it's a terrific question because it also reminds us of, the term of art today is multitasking, and that every president is doing many different things at one time. And to look at the variety of things that are going on in December of 1862 in this man's life. So I'll get to the cabinet crisis in a second. They're also discussing the admission of West Virginia as a state. There's all kinds of other correspondence taking place. He also writes what I think is one of the greatest letters ever written. And it's a letter that he writes on December 23rd, just about 10 days from now. So the cabinet crisis that he's dealing with is the maneuvering that's going on among radical Republicans to try and get Seward out of Lincoln's cabinet. And there are meetings that are taking place. There's, everyone will be surprised, especially in Washington, to learn that there's tremendous amounts of gossip and backstabbing and gamesmanship going on. And so Lincoln knows this is happening, and there's an attempt to make a power play. So who ultimately is in control of the cabinet? Is it the President of the United States? Is it Congress? And ultimately, to whom do cabinet members serve, at whose pleasure? So Seward, they're trying to push out. Chase is behind this, but Chase is trying to keep his fingerprints off it. Of course, both Seward and Chase were competitors for the presidency. Chase is incredibly ambitious. And the genius of what Lincoln does is he puts his house in order. And the way he does it is by bringing in senators to meetings and compelling them to say publicly in front of one another what was being said privately behind cabinet members' backs. And Chase sits there mum, won't say anything. Seward offers his resignation. Chase offers his resignation. And what does Lincoln do? He tears up both resignations and keeps them in the cabinet. Famous phrase, he says he walks out with a pumpkin over each shoulder. It's Lincoln as a political genius, and his ability to do that in December, as you say, a week from now, at the moment that he is under all this extraordinary pressure, and military affairs are going abysmally. Let's not forget, this is a war to preserve the Union. Now, I mentioned the letter. December 23rd, he writes a letter to Fannie McCulloch. Fannie McCulloch is the daughter of a friend of his who was killed in battle. And he says to her, in this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all. And to the young, it comes with bitterest agony because it takes them unawares. The older have learned to ever expect it. I am anxious to afford some alleviation of your present distress. Perfect relief is not possible except with time. You cannot now realize it, that you will ever feel better. Is this not so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. That letter, December 23rd, 1862, to a young girl, from this man who himself, of course, suffered the tremendous span of emotions, the melancholia that we know he was suspect to, but also the storytelling and the joke-making, the swings of life. He who had lost his own son, really, in February of that year, and was grievously suffering not only personal loss, but taking so personally the loss of these soldiers, that he could sit down at this moment with emancipation on the horizon and say, you are sure to be happy again. For me, helps to bring home the point that you're making about the variety of things that's taking place in his life and in the nation's life at that moment.